Hello everyone, and welcome back to another True Crime Mysteries video. Thank you all for being here. Today we're discussing 4 more solved cold cases. Number 1. Lindy Sue Beekler. On December 5, 1975, Lindy Sue was discovered stabbed to death in her Lancaster, Pennsylvania apartment. Her aunt and uncle discovered her body soon after the attack around 8:30 p.m. There had been no sign of forced entry, and Lindy Sue had last been seen grocery shopping at 6:30 p.m., leading detectives to believe that she'd been attacked shortly after returning home. Her shopping bags were still on the dining room table. Lindy Sue was married, and her husband Phil was quickly cleared as a suspect. Her autopsy revealed she'd been stabbed 19 times with 2 different knives. One was still embedded in her neck and had come from within the home. The other wasn't found at the crime scene. It was a horrific scene and had been a violent death. Lindy had several defensive wounds on her hands and arms, but she fought back. At some point, she'd been able to injure her attacker, and blood evidence from an unknown male was able to be preserved. Unfortunately, despite an exhaustive investigation, all suspects in the case were able to be eliminated, and eventually, without anything new, the case went cold. Over the next 4 decades, the case would be reopened and re-examined. The DNA was retested in 1997 against all the suspects in the original investigation, but they were cleared. The foreign male DNA was uploaded to CODIS in 2000, and the FBI BAU reviewed the case and hypothesized that the killer was a male who knew Lindy and committed the crime in a fit of rage. When the Golden State Killer was identified using genetic genealogy in 2018, the Lancaster District Attorney's Office put forth Lindy Sue's cold case forward for consideration. The genetic genealogy testing was approved, and they began working with Parabon Nanolabs. In 2019, Parabon created a computer-generated image of what the suspect might have looked like based on his DNA. Next, they worked on a new method of establishing a family tree for the suspect.
As far as the genetic genealogy, because there were no genealogically promising individual genetic matches to the suspect's DNA in this case, for those of you who are following genetic genealogy, the matches were only 30 centimorgans and below, which is incredibly distant. For that reason, I had to pursue a novel, non-traditional strategy as a possible alternate avenue to identify potential persons of interest to the investigation. This approach relies on a survey of geographic and immigration patterns, as well as associated surnames, and it necessitated that the subject had deep roots in the local Lancaster, Pennsylvania community. The matches trees, the people that were sharing DNA with this unknown suspect, contained many recent immigrant families from the province of Catanzaro in Calabria, southern Italy. And historical sources revealed that the majority of the Italian immigrants in Lancaster were from a small town named Gasparina, which is in that province. So this was consistent with the patterns that I observed in the match data. And it was determined from my research that there were approximately 2,300 residents of Italian ancestry living in the city of Lancaster at the time of the crime. Local historical records from the early 20th century were thoroughly researched and surveyed for residents of Lancaster who listed their birthplace as Gasparina, Italy. From these records, a list of individuals and families local to Lancaster with roots in Gasparina was compiled and their surnames noted. Then I performed descendancy research from these families to identify their male descendants who were of the appropriate age to be a candidate to be our suspect. These individuals' family trees were then built out in order to determine if they were a full Italian ancestry and all of their ancestral lines originated in Gasparina or nearby, because that is what the match data and the snapshot predictions were telling us. This person needed to be a full ancestry from that area. Now, these restrictions further narrowed the scope of the subsequent research because there were very few individuals living in Lancaster at the time of the crime that were the right age, gender, and had a family tree consistent with these origins. So this allowed me to prioritize the candidates whose descent was determined to be exclusively from families with origins in Gasparina. And then each of those individuals was further investigated through newspaper archives, public people search databases, social media, court records, and other resources. Now, after months of this type of research, one individual was identified who I believed was an especially compelling candidate to possibly be the suspect. At that point, I turned that lead over to investigators. Investigative genetic genealogy like this should be treated only as a lead generator, a tip. It's a highly scientific tip, but the tip just the same. And so at that point, then investigators followed that tip, and you see the outcome today.
They were able to identify a suspect who was discovered to be living and had never moved from the Lancaster area. 65-year-old David Sinopoli had never been a suspect in the original investigation, but detectives learned he lived in the same building as the Beechlers in 1975. Sinopoli was placed under surveillance and was seen to have discarded a to-go coffee cup, which was collected and used to compare to the suspect's DNA. It was a confirmed match. Sinopoli was arrested at his home on December 11, 2022, nearly 47 years to the day of Lindy Sue's murder. Sinopoli didn't have a significant criminal history. In 2004, he pleaded guilty to invasion of privacy and disorderly conduct. He had been working at a tanning salon and admitted to spying on a woman tanning. Since then, he has kept a very low-profile life. He married in 1974, divorced in 1986, and was remarried a year later. He has 3 children, was an avid hunter, according to social media, and frequently traveled to Italy. He was charged with 1 count of criminal homicide and is being held without bail while he waits further court proceedings. No word yet on if he has any further court dates.
Lindy Sue Beechler was on the minds of many throughout the years. Certainly, law enforcement has never forgotten about her, and this arrest marks the first step in obtaining justice for Lindy Sue Beechler and holding her killer responsible.
Number 2. Betty Rolf. It was during a blizzard on November 6, 1988, when Betty Rolf decided to walk to work at the Appleton County Air Banquet Room in Appleton, Wisconsin. It wasn't her normal routine to walk to work, but 60-year-old Betty didn't like to drive in the snow, and her son wasn't able to give her a ride that morning. It shouldn't have taken her long. It was only 10 blocks from her home, but she never arrived. She was reported missing when her husband discovered she hadn't returned home from work. It was then that he learned she'd never arrived that day. Her body was found covered in gravel and partially clad under a railroad bridge 2 days later. An autopsy showed she'd been strangled to death, sexually assaulted, and beaten. The murder case shocked the community. Betty had been well known to the area. She was well liked. No one could imagine anyone setting out to hurt her. That, paired with the differentiation between her normal routine and the snowstorm, led law enforcement to believe it was a crime of opportunity. DNA evidence was collected at the time of the initial investigation, but all that could be done was tested against the suspects they had, which eliminated all. Eventually, the case went cold.
Police found the body of an unidentified woman in her early 60s in a ravine off Spencer Street at 11 o'clock this morning.
34 years ago. This is what Local 5's coverage of the cold case looked like.
We have a female adult who was found in the 1600 block of West Spencer Street at about 11 o'clock this morning. The cause of death at this time is undetermined.
For 34 years, law enforcement officers unsuccessfully searched for Betty Rolf's killer.
In 2001, the DNA was input into CODIS, the federal database, and the state database, but nothing came up. In 2019, the case was reopened in hopes of using genetic genealogy to find a suspect. This year, they were able to narrow down the DNA to 2 brothers. Law enforcement approached one of the brothers, who cooperated with police but believed his brother to be deceased. He supplied a DNA sample which eliminated him as a suspect, leading law enforcement to believe that 66-year-old Gene C. Meyer of Tacoma, Washington, was their suspect. In the 80s, Meyer lived within a mile of Betty Rolf and left Wisconsin shortly after her murder, relocating to Washington. Law enforcement in both states worked together to locate Meyer, and he was put under surveillance. Law enforcement were able to collect a DNA sample from the handle of his truck. Once it was positively matched with the suspect's DNA, he was arrested. He is currently being held and is awaiting extradition to Wisconsin. Number 3. Evelyn Fisher-Bamforth. It was January 22, 1980 in Miramar, Florida, when Evelyn Fisher-Bamforth opted to stay home for the evening. The 32-year-old nurse had hurt her knee and decided it would be best to rest it so she could get back to work. Her husband John went out for the evening. The couple were newly married. They had only just moved to Florida from the Cayman Islands. John worked in restaurants as a bartender and manager and was just settling into Miramar. Evelyn was from Chilliwack, British Columbia, and was a shining star in her family, the first to become a nurse in her family, and she was described as caring, smart, and a joy to be around. When John came home that evening, he said that he saw police tape on their front door advising no one to enter. He had no idea what was going on and entered anyway. Immediately, he noticed something was wrong. Furniture had been strewn about, and there was stuff everywhere. When he went into their bedroom, he said that their bed was half soaked in blood. Evelyn was nowhere to be seen. Law enforcement hadn't notified him or stayed at the crime scene. It would only be when he went to the police department that he was notified that his wife had been murdered earlier that evening. He was given little details about what had happened, and he was devastated by the news. A friend had discovered the murder when she forgot her keys and went over to Evelyn and John's house. She knew Evelyn was home that night and knew she was supposed to be in. She knocked on the door several times, but there was no answer. Then she saw one of the panes of glass next to the door had been broken and called the police. When police entered, they found Evelyn's body in the bedroom. She'd been brutally bludgeoned to death, and she'd been sexually assaulted. John had been at work, and his alibi was quickly cleared. Months later, they did have a strong suspect in the case. When another county's police department approached Miramar PD with a nearly identical murder. The suspect in that case was Ronald Eugene Richards. The 32-year-old was out on parole for murdering his girlfriend in 1975 in Ohio. When law enforcement went to question Richards, they discovered he lived only 12 doors down from Evelyn and John. The Miramar PD didn't have enough evidence to charge Richards, but in the other case, the Volusia County PD had enough to charge and arrested him. He was convicted in that case in 1982 and served 38 years in prison before he was released in 2020. In 2022, Evelyn's case was reopened and the evidence in the case was retested for DNA. There, they found a sample of foreign male DNA and ran it through CODIS. From there, they were able to positively identify it to Ronald Eugene Richards. Richard was out on probation and was quickly arrested in Ohio. He is now waiting to be extradited back to Florida, where he will be charged with Evelyn's murder. Miramar PD have also stated that they believe Richards was a serial predator and are looking to see if any other cold cases are connected to him. John, who now resides in the UK, has expressed relief about the new development. He said that the murder of his wife had a devastating impact on his life, leading to substance abuse to numb the guilt he felt, which became an issue he struggled with for decades. He told the media that despite the relief of the arrest, the news also brought up difficult memories. He said, quote, "But for Evelyn, justice is the most important thing."
I would certainly want to see justice for Evelyn. Yeah. And I don't believe in this closure thing. One never has closure.
No word yet on what is next for Richard. He may opt to take a plea agreement if offered. In Florida, the death penalty remains on the table at this time. Well, that is it for this video. Thank you so much for sticking around to the end. As always, if you want to support the channel, the easiest way is to hit the like button. You can also subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss my next upload. Other ways to support the channel are joining my Patreon or channel membership. I also have merch, and you'll find all the links in the description box, plus a few extras. Don't forget to follow me on Instagram, TikTok, and Twitter for more. But with that being said, thank you so much for being here and supporting what I do. It is very appreciated. That is it for me. I will see you all in the next one. Bye for now.